So tonight, we are actually going to cover the entire first chapter. How about that? The whole chapter.
I was going to say, would
Now,
we go to midnight?
Yeah, that's right. Now, last week we learned in the historical background section that Nebuchadnezzar, after his defeat of the Egyptian and Assyrian coalition at the Battle of Carchemish, he learns of his father's death. And therefore he quickly returns to Babylon to take over and to be installed as king. Jehoiakim, who is one of the puppet kings of Judah, who actually, if I remember, was installed by Pharaoh Necho, contrary to, of course, Jeremiah and Ezekiel's constant warnings, where they kept telling the Jews, don't resist Nebuchadnezzar. He is the arm of punishment of the Lord. But they did resist. So Jehoiakim rebels against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar returns, of course, the first time, 606, 605, invades and carries away some of the temple vessels and the elite and educated class of Judah. So if you'll go to Daniel chapter 1, this is what it says in verses 1 and 2. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar. Remember, we said Shinar is the territorial area around Babylon. It's the literal plain that it's built on. To the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. So, we see here that certain young aristocratic men in the lineage of the kings of Israel, of their big families, who looked very promising, were ordered by the king through his administrator named Ashpenaz to put these guys, and of course 4 of them were specifically named, but there were lots of them. There's a whole group of them. But the story focuses on these 4. They were put through an intense 3-year, as I said, quote, graduate school program, eventually to be tested to determine who were the very best. The very best would then be given the highest or better administrative positions in the Babylonian government. This included a variety of things that they were taught in a matter of 3 years. First of all, they had to learn Aramaic. So they learned a brand new language. Secondly, they had to learn all the customs and laws of Babylon. Thirdly, they had to learn mathematics. And I noted here that the Babylonians gave us basic geometry. They are the inventors of the 360-degree circle. They are the inventors of the 60-minute hour. They also highly developed astronomy, including very precise measurements of the visible planets, and found ways to predict through observation solar and lunar eclipses. So they were very great students of the stars in the sky. You know, that was their forte.
Was it more about astrology?
It was both astronomy and astrology, because there were part of them that did the scientific study, and there were part of them that did the astrological predictive nature of that. Yes.
Okay, I'm wondering why Nebuchadnezzar was emptying, shall we say, Babylon, particularly of the higher ranking, so to speak, the smarter and so on. Was Babylon that poor or stupider or whatever you want to use?
No, it's just that he was developing a vast empire. Remember, this is the time when he beat the Assyrians and the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish. So The Assyrian Empire, which had ruled this whole area for hundreds of years, was now, had basically fallen into disrepair. They had been militarily defeated, and Babylon takes all of that geography over. So they're installing their system, their laws, their government, their administrators, their tax people in all this area. So they needed a lot of administrative people to do it. And instead of, he was needing, quote, manpower. So therefore he decided, let's take the best and the brightest of the peoples we conquer, and we'll educate them and see how they do. And if they do well, we'll install them. So that's the purpose of why Daniel and his friends end up there.
Do you think it was a smart move?
Yeah, I think it was, because again, why do you destroy the intelligentsia of a whole culture rather than use it? I mean, the people that have done the opposite, like to a great extent Stalin, Mao, and you go on, they created some real cultural problems for themselves. They did away with so many teachers, for instance, university people, anyone that they felt intellectually was challenging, then who do you have left?
Those people thought they were going to be threatened by the smart people.
Yes. And that's often what tyrants do. But that's not what Nebuchadnezzar did. It's not what Darius did, who was, of course, was the Media-Persian king to take over.
They were actually kind of smart in a way.
Yep. They were.
Can you send a letter out to everybody in the United States and tell them that's what Trump's trying to do?
Yeah, that would be interesting to do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the border. That's what he's trying to do. Hey, listen, you just send it to the smart ones, and you don't have to send 3 letters.
I was thinking of this today, earlier about this, and if you take the major empires of the last thousands of years, and you look at when were they in their ascendancy? Okay? Some of them, of course, have lasted for thousands of years, but they weren't in their ascendancy for thousands of years. And you divide it out, you find, people have calculated this, that the empires usually are ascendant for about 250 years. Then they decline. And as like Norman has said before, and he's going to say it again, that's human nature. They start out, they build up, you have a smaller government, you have a smaller economy, you have little debt. What do you start to do eventually? You start to build a bigger government, you hire more and more people, you build more and more laws, you have more and more administration, and of course then you start increasing your need for money, you tax more, you start to depreciate your currency. It's exactly what the Romans did. Absolutely exactly what they did.
You've got it in Turkey right now.
Right. It's going on in Turkey right now.
Easy.
It's going on in Venezuela right now. There are multiple.
Venezuela's been going on now for a
couple of years. It's the predictable decline that occurs, and any
Got it in Honduras.
any culture honestly that thinks they're going to avoid it is foolish, because they can't change human nature.
Yeah. Human nature doesn't want to share.
Yeah. We make the same mistakes over and over again, remarkably, but we do. So, also, it says in the text in verses 3 and 4, do you see where it says, he says, and they were showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge. Those things include, when you look at what they mean in the Hebrew, they tested them for logic. That's what it meant about discerning knowledge. Think about it. Years and years ago, in the educational system of this country, It's a tragedy that, of course, we've changed this. We used to teach logic as a class. You know, oh, that we could only do that again and teach logic. But they did. And then, of course, it talked about wisdom, which, of course, means insight. Okay, they had to show insight and understanding into things, not just facts. So all these things they were being taught to see how they're going to do. Now, it's interesting, and you'll see this in verses 5 and 6. Let's read 5 and 6. And the king appointed for them daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter into the king's personal service. And then, of course, we're going to read in a minute verses 6 and 7. Now, we see that to facilitate this program for all of these young people, he did not, as we could put it, for Mikey would appreciate this, he didn't feed them K-rations. You know, he fed them the best of the best. They were to learn, they were to be well fed, etc. Now, this, of course, included both meat and vegetables as well as wine. We see this. This was the king's own cuisine. But this created, as we're going to see, a moral conflict and a religious conflict for Daniel and his friends. And this is going to be the first event which occurs, which creates a problem, and we're going to see how it's resolved. Now, the four mentioned, of course, are seen in verses 6 and 7. And let's read those. Now, among them, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are their Hebrew names. Then, verse 7, the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. To Daniel he designated the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, it's interesting. Let's go through first what their Jewish names meant. Daniel's name meant God is my judge. Hananiah's name in Hebrew meant beloved of God. Mishael in Hebrew means who is like the Lord. And Azariah means the Lord is my help. So, the Babylonians, in an effort to acculturate these people to Babylonian culture, strip them of their Hebrew names and attempt to give them, or do give them, Babylonian names. And the Babylonian names they give them are quite interesting and quite purposeful. So, to Daniel they give him Belteshazzar, which means the Prince of Bel. Bel being one of their main gods. Okay? Shadrach means in Aramaic, illuminated by the sun god. Meshach means in Aramaic, who is like the moon god. And Abednego, he must have really enjoyed this one, means the servant of Nego, and Nego is a term that means, in as we understand it, Satan or Lucifer. They give them not only pagan names, they take all of their names, which, and I point out here under E, the Hebrew names all include either El or IAH, which are both references to God. Both those in Hebrew have a reference to God. So what do? The Babylonian names, of course, include references to Bel, Marduk, another one of their gods, another one of their gods, which really stands for the planet Venus, and of course Nebo, which stands for the demon, the demonic entity of Lucifer, as they would put it. So, this is what they give them. In other words, These boys start with spiritual names, and of course, the Babylonians tried to corrupt this and change their identities to pagan ones. This is a very purposeful thing that the Babylonians do to them. Now, it's interesting here. When we receive Christ, we are transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of God. You'll find, if you want to, let's read it. Keep your hand, Daniel, but go to Colossians chapter 1. This is where it states this. It states it many places in the New Testament, but this is probably one of the most famous places it states it. Colossians 1, verses 13 and 14. Paul says, "For he delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." So, we start out, if you want to put it this way, with our pagan identity, our non-Christian identity, and then as we become Christians, we are given a spiritual identity, a godly identity. But I find it very interesting as I search through this that we are also given a new name by God. Did you know that? Turn back to the book of Revelation, chapter 2. Revelation 2. And we're going to look at verse 17. This is stated in the commentary to the church at Pergamum. As he concludes his message to the church at Pergamum, he says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, to him I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone." If you want me to, I can describe what that means. "And a new name, written on the stone, which no one but he who knows, but he who receives it." Isn't it interesting? I'm sorry. The white stone is an allusion to a practice in the Roman Empire. For instance, if you were a gladiator and you survived many, many tests and you became retired as a successful gladiator, they would give you this special stone that was white in color. And inscribed on it was information about your successes.
Like our plaques.
Right, like a plaque.
Okay.
And this allowed you special privileges in Rome. You could go to the Colosseum free. You could go to festivals free. Yes, it gave you these special privileges that were given to you by the Roman Empire for your service. So the analogy is that God gives us his own version of the white stone. And inscribed on it are things that he says about us. You know, beloved of the Lord, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But he gives us a new name. Now, I suspect we're not going to know that new name for a while, and I'll show you why I suspect that. But it's interesting that this principle continues through the Old Testament. So go back now, past Daniel, and I want you to go to Isaiah chapter 56. And we're going to look at verses 4 and 5. Nope, this one's 55. Starting verse 4 of Isaiah 56. For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths and choose what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant, to them I will give in my house and within my walls a memorial, and a name better than that of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name which will not be cut off. Now he's referring to the millennial age here. So in the millennial age, God gives everyone who's faithful a new name. And undoubtedly a new title, and undoubtedly new duties also there.
In the millennium age.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, since you're in Isaiah, go from chapter 56 to chapter 62.
Never heard that.
And we're going to read verses 2 and 3. Again, in the millennial age, and the nations will see your righteousness, and all kings your glory, and you will be called by a new name, which the Lord, which the mouth of the Lord will designate. And you will also be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. So these are, again, additional promises about those who will be in the millennial age. Now go from chapter 62 of Isaiah to chapter 65 of Isaiah. And we're going to look at verses 15 and 16. So starting in verse 15, again about the millennial time. And you will leave your name for a curse to my chosen ones, and the Lord God will slay you. He's talking about the nations that disobey. And my servants will be called by another name, because he who is blessed in the earth shall be blessed by the Lord of truth, and he who swears in the earth shall swear by the Lord of truth, because the former troubles are forgotten, and because they are hidden from my sight. Now, there's one other element here that I think is interesting, and you're going to have to hold your place in Daniel and go back to almost the very end of your Bible, again back to Revelation. I'm going to give you an idea about where your name's going to come from. You're going to go to Revelation chapter 19. Now, starting in verse 11 is the return of Christ to the earth. He comes as a warrior, not as a servant this time. Okay? He comes with power, authority. He comes with a crown on his head. Of course, it says he's clothed with a robe dipped in blood. Why? Because he's killing his enemies that are coming against him. And of course, it says there's a sharp sword that he has, that he might smite the nations. And in verse 16, and on his robe and on his thigh, he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I think that it is because of that name, of course, that everyone who follows him has his authority. It is because of that name that we rule and reign with him. So I think probably the names we get are going to be derivations some way of that.
Instead of the word Christian, per se.
There's also in verse 12, it says, his eyes are flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written on him which no one knows except himself.
Yes.
So then, the same like we just read about ourselves, that we're going to be given names which no one knows.
Right. I think the point is, he's not going to give us the name until it's the right time to have the name. Just like these guys were given names at birth, or renamed in a pagan society. Okay? In ours, it's the reverse. we are born into a pagan world, and then when we become Christians, we're transferred and we're given new names. I think it's a rather...
So why he really did that? Did he do that, Nebuchadnezzar, to break their spirit?
Yes, because he didn't want them to identify as Jews anymore. He wanted to bring them into Babylonian culture and to eliminate any of their Jewishness.
And they were young, I'm sure he thought he could do that.
Of course, they were 15-year-old boys at this time, and possibly girls also. I mean, again, we're only looking at 4 of them here at this time. There were lots of others, but now let's look at verses back to Daniel 1. Let's look at verses 8 through 16. Let's read them, and then we'll go through them. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are of your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. And I'm going to show you how he had a very real reason to have fear. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. In other words, there's the main guy, Ashpenaz, and then there's this other person who's not named, but he's the local overseer of them, okay? Maybe their tutor, for instance. Yes. And he says, Daniel says to him, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, in the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for the 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine that they were to drink, and kept giving them the vegetables. Now, some interesting things I think are learned here. Despite their names being changed, which of course Daniel and the other youth could not control. That was the choice that they made. They couldn't do anything about that. It says that, quote, Daniel made up his mind about this issue of the food. I was looking this up in the Hebrew. A more literal way to put it could be he could not let it go from his mind. In other words, it was constantly on his mind. It was bugging him. He was convicted about it internally. He just couldn't let it go. So, the point is that they could not eat the meat. Now why? Turn if you would, keep your hand in Daniel, turn back to Exodus. These boys obviously knew their Torah. And that's why they had a problem. Go to Exodus chapter 34. And we're going to look at verse 15. Well, we'll start at 14. Exodus 34, starting verse 14. For you shall not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods, and sacrifice to their gods, and someone invite you to eat of his sacrifice. And you take someone, and it goes on. In other words, you're not allowed to eat meat sacrificed to another god, to an idol. And that was, and there's other places too, but that they knew this prohibition. These boys did. Okay? So the Jew could not eat what was sacrificed to a pagan idol. This is why Daniel petitioned Ashpenaz and then the official underneath him, and, of course, was asking for this exception. Now, I think a number of things are pointed out here if you read between the lines. Remember, these are 15-year-old kids who have been taken away from their culture, seen all these people die around them. They're exiled 500 miles away, put in a pagan society. There's no reason that we have to believe that they're around their parents at all. They're put in this special schooling situation. They're given different names. And look what? Look at the courage of Daniel. Look at the determination of Daniel. And I think also look at the social skills that would be needed to do this. You know, how many 15-year-olds do you know who could negotiate this with older adults who were officials in a kingdom? They showed a remarkable poise and understanding and ability to express their arguments to be able to do this. They were very unique and skilled in this way.
Do you think, though, that they still, although being so bright, but they still wouldn't be able to do that without God's help?
I think so, but at the same time, it's very clear in the Hebrew that Daniel had to persist at this. It was his choice to either drop it or go with it. That's what the Hebrew is indicating about how this was on his mind.
But don't you think that can be like when the Holy Spirit nods on us?
And it very could be, absolutely. Now here's the interesting thing about...
Because Daniel had to fulfill God's plan.
Well, he didn't have to, but he agreed to. He was willing to do the will of God. The other boys didn't do this. Remember? See the comparison they made? The other youths kept eating the meat.
I mean, God's ultimate plan.
Yes.
Daniel was in that plan as a prophet.
I agree. And that's why he was, and we'll see not only how God used him, how God blessed him because of this. So the first answer is no. Now think about it. So Ashpenaz says, it ain't going to happen. And of course, he's under direct orders from the king. And the king has been known to do some fairly nasty things to those that disobey him. Let me give you an example. Turn from Daniel back to your left to Jeremiah 29. And there's plenty of examples of this in the writings of the Babylonians, but I'm just going to give you one example in the writings of the prophets about this. Jeremiah 29:22. He's talking about, they're going to be exiled. They're going to have a punishment for the 490 years that they did not perform the Shemitah year. So they get 70 years of Shemitahs, in other words, is their penalty. And in verse 22, and because of them, a curse shall be used by all the exiles from Judah who are in Babylon, saying, quote, may the Lord make you like Zedekiah, who was the first king when he came the first time, and he put Zedekiah's eyes out and brought him in chains back to Babylon and killed his children right in front of him. Right. We've read about that actually last week. He says, may the Lord make you like Zedekiah and like Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. This was one of the things he did if he wanted to punish someone. He would.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes. Yeah. Now, you're going to see in Daniel, and we get into a few chapters here ahead, that apparently Nebuchadnezzar has a fascination with fire. Because what story comes up here pretty soon? Yes, he takes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who won't bow down to the idol, and what does he do? He takes this massive furnace, they make it 7 times hotter than normal, and then they throw them in it. So again, he's going to roast them. Except it doesn't work out that way for Nebuchadnezzar, interestingly enough.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to read something to you. You don't have to turn here if you don't want to, but I thought this really is echoed in the New Testament, this whole principle. And I'm going to read it in 2 Peter. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 4 through 8. This is the New Testament application. For by these he has granted to us his precious and magnificent promises. These, of course, are found in the written word, right? In order that by them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. Isn't that exactly what Daniel did? He took what he knew of the Torah, he knew of the prohibition, he persisted in trying to apply it and asking for it to be applied to his life to overcome the corruption that was going to occur if he didn't do it. Verse 5 in 2 Peter 1. Now for this very reason also applying all diligence in your faith, isn't that what Daniel did? He was diligent about his faith. Supply moral excellence. That was one of the reasons why he did it, because of the moral considerations. And in moral excellence, knowledge. He had knowledge of the word of the Torah. And in your knowledge, self-control. And in your self-control, perseverance. Didn't he have to persevere in this to gain approval finally? And in your perseverance, godliness. That's the result of what he got by persevering. And your godliness, brotherly kindness, etc., etc. So we see this very principle expressed in the New Testament that we see in Daniel's life here. So, undoubtedly, of course, it was God's hand moving in this that caused the 4 boys in a short 10-day period to obviously look better in their appearance than all the others. I just have a hard time explaining that 10 days of nutrition is going to transform them that much. I think God was working in this supernaturally so that it became really obvious to the officials. Man, these kids look good.
I don't know. Have you ever tried it then?
No, I haven't. But then again, I don't eat much meat sacrificed to idols either. So.
Remember last time I tried it? I gained weight.
No.
Now I know why.
Now I know why.
Vegetables.
Okay, now back to Daniel 1, and let's finish off reading verses 17 through 21. And so for these youths, these 4, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. And Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, the final test is here. The 3 years is up. And the king talked with them. And out of all of them, not one of them was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. I think the implication is they not only entered his service, they entered at a high level of his service. And so for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in the realm. Verse 21, and Daniel continued until the 1st year of Cyrus the king. Now, some very interesting things that are said here. As a result of them taking these risks and being faithful to God's word and wanting to then do God's will, the Lord specially blessed these 4, and they excelled in their studies of language, science, geometry, Babylonian literature, Babylonian law, and Daniel was given a special gift one that you could not learn, one you could not study to master. He was given the ability to interpret dreams and visions. Now, of course, this is extremely critical because as we go into the next chapters of Daniel, if he hadn't been given that ability by God, he would not be able to do the things that Nebuchadnezzar asks him to do, because Nebuchadnezzar has dreams and visions, and only Daniel, of all, is able to accurately interpret them. So God gives him the very tools he's going to need in the future to be successful.
I agree with what Ahmed said earlier. These young men have been chosen by the Lord.
Yes. That's true, but it's partly because they were willing to take the steps.
Right.
Okay? So, let me give you kind of an analogy here to what's going on. They end this 3-year extensive and intensive course of study. It's now time to be assessed. I'm going to tell you this because you may or may not know this, but this is much like what happens in a PhD program. Okay? When I was in my doctoral program, I had 2 years of extensive studies. I forget, 11 courses, I forget what it was, something like that. Now, you take all those courses, and of course you have to pass them with at least a B average. But after you get done with them, you have to then take what's called a comprehensive final. And this is a 2-day test. And they test you over everything that you have learned in the previous 2 years. So you sit down, and for 2 days you're writing 8 hours a day, 2 days in a row. You get done, they grade them all, and if you have a passing grade, then you get the right to write your dissertation.
You, of course, had no problem with that.
Of course not.
Did you type here? Because I know.
No, I did not. No, back then you didn't type. But think about it. You know, I finished my course I finally graduated in 89 with my PhD. So, I mean, when did computers start? I mean, I don't think we even had the Commodore 64 until, 85? I mean, there weren't really personal computers particularly.
There weren't any personal computers.
Right.
Period.
There were big ones.
Yeah, it started with IBM.
Yeah.
Typewriter.
I remember buying my Commodore 64 because it had a typing program, and that's how I did my dissertation. Okay? It would print it out on a dot matrix printer. So, but at any rate, so of course these guys passed with flying colors. They were superior to all the other students, but notice what it says in verse 20. It says, as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in his realm. These kids not only were better than all the other kids, these kids did better than all of the officials that he already had working who were older adults.
Magicians included.
Yeah. So,
Sound familiar?
so these guys were really excelled in what they did. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that even though they were extremely successful in this 3-year study, this created a huge problem for them that we're going to see that they're going to have in the future. Because in the future, the officials in the kingdom are not very happy with these boys.
They're so jealous.
They're great. They're very jealous, and they set a trap for them.
All human nature.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to see in future chapters here. Now, in closing, let's note something about verse 21. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Now, this is Daniel's notation that he puts in about the length of service that he had in especially Babylon. Now, we know that, therefore, from 606, when they first came to Babylon, we know that he was an administrator, and we're going to see what kind of administrator was as we go through the chapters here. until 539 BC. That was the first year of the conquest of Babylon by Darius, the Median Persian. And then it says, if you don't have to turn here, but in Daniel 10:1, it says that Daniel served at least 3 years as an advisor to Cyrus. So we know that his term of being an official went to at least 536 BC. At that point, Daniel probably was 85 years old. We have no indication that when Darius allowed the Jews to be released to come back, we have no indication that Daniel came back with them. I think there's great implication that he died there in Babylon, being still under the service of King Darius. Now, I want to point something out to you to finish. And that's Isaiah 44. So turn back to your left from Daniel, back to the book of Isaiah. And these, of course, are the things that confound the liberal theologians because they can't explain them. Isaiah 44, verse 28, and then we're going to also read the first 5 verses of Isaiah 45. So, the last verse of Isaiah 44 says this. Now remember, this is Isaiah. We estimate that he wrote this probably somewhere around 680 BC, approximately. Could have been maybe even 690. We don't know the exact year, but we know when Isaiah lived, so it was in this area that he had written these words, okay? And he says, it is I, verse 28, it is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, for he will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple your foundation will be laid. And then going through in 45:1, thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed. He's calling Cyrus, the king of Media, Persia, his anointed, his shepherd, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that the gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. I will shatter the doors of bronze and cut through the iron bars, and I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden wealth of the secret places, in order that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by your name. For the sake of Jacob, my servant, and Israel, my chosen one, I have also called you by your name, and I have given you a title of honor, though you have not known me. Notice that. Though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no other God. And I will gird you, though you have not known me. He gave this prophecy, Isaiah, conservatively, 120 years before Cyrus was born. Because we know Cyrus was born in Media, Persia, in 590 BC. He names him by name 120 years before he ever was born.
The one he conquered
Babylon.
How old was he?
I think he was in his 30s.
30?
Yeah, I could count it, but I think it was in his 30s. But interestingly, in these verses, I'm not going to go through it all now, where he says, I'll open the doors before so that the gates will not be shut. It is the exact battle plan by which Cyrus beat Babylon. Exact. What happened, and we'll go through it a little bit here at the end of Daniel, but the Euphrates ran underneath Babylon. Okay?
Yeah, you talked about that.
So Cyrus went upstream and dammed up the Euphrates and made a reservoir and dried the river. The Babylonians had built gates of iron and bronze all along, okay? But they were underwater. So now they dried up, and he's able to break through the gates, and in one night, he marched his army through the dry riverbed into the middle of Babylon and takes over. One night. In other words, you can only conclude God said to Nebuchadnezzar, "You're done." He starts. My plan continues. And Cyrus was the one. He calls him my shepherd because remember what he said. He says, you are the one that will help lay the foundation for the temple. You are the one that will help lay the walls for Jerusalem. And that's exactly what Cyrus does. Yeah, he gives an edict to send them back and funds them to do it. First to build the walls, or first to build the temple, and second to build the walls. It's exactly the way the prophecy said it would. That is a very specific prophetic word. So that's the first chapter. Now you're going to have to wait a while for the second chapter.
Yeah, that's